Welcome to NucleCast, the official podcast of the ANWA Deterrence Center. Each week, we bring you leading experts for a lively discussion on topics related to strategic nuclear deterrence. Our host is Dr. Adam Lowther, Director of Strategic Programs at the National Strategic Research Institute. The views of the hosts and the guests are their own.
Welcome back to another great episode of NucleCast. Of course, I'm your host, Adam Lowther, and today we have a great guest. Colonel Glen Schilland just left as the Air Attaché in South Korea. And, Glen and I have known each other a while, and I didn't realize that he had gone to be the Air Attaché until I was looking him up, and then I was like, he's in South Korea. And so, as many of you, the listeners, know, it's an interesting time in Korea right now. And so in particular with the DPRK and the moves they're making, their ballistic missile program, their nuclear program. So who better to talk about that than the very guy who just had the job as Air Attaché? Glen, welcome to NucleCast.
Thanks, Adam. Good to be here.
So tell us I don't know if a lot of folks sort of understand the Attaché system and the role that officers will play as, the defense attaché, the air attaché, this whole office that represents the Department of Defense and interacts with militaries and governments. Can you explain that for our listeners? How does it work? And then how do you become an attaché?
Right. Yeah. So the attachés are, for each service, they're the representatives to each nation that they're assigned to for their, expertise. So as the air attaché, I was the Air Force representative and to Korea, interacted mostly with the Korean Air Force, and then I was the advisor directly to the ambassador. I worked under the defense attaché, who was also the Army attaché. And generally speaking, in a defense attaché office, you'll have a defense attaché who may or may not be the senior officer in the country, senior military officer in the country, and he may or may not be, or she may not be the Security Cooperation Office as well. In Korea, there's a separate Security Cooperation Office that does, basically foreign military sales, and training and evaluations, exercises, that sort of thing is in the SCO, and that is just Mag K for Korea. In the DAO, we mostly deal with just service to service relationships, whether that's through the academy or through direct interactions through like the A3 or A5 or between the chiefs. So we're responsible for any visitors that come through, from colonels all the way up to the Secretary of Defense, and monitoring them. They're getting them meetings with whoever they want to meet with, whether it's the Chief of Staff of the Air Force or the Minister of Defense. And so you do those visits. You also do some reporting on what's going on, so that the people back in the States understand what has happened in those meetings. And then you also are a representative during any events that happen in the country. So, for instance, if somebody has a national day, you got to get dressed up and go and eat and drink for your country. It's just one of the it's a hardship of the duty. But no, seriously, it's a lot of fun. Becoming an attaché. All the services have a foreign area officer program, so the FAO. It's a 16 Foxtrot in the Air Force, but the Army's had, I think, the longest running FAO program. They do it really well, and the Air Force has only had the program for maybe 5 or 6 years. Still trying to build it up. It used to be called RASPAS, the Regional Air Affairs Specialist or the Political Affairs Specialist. And it's kind of difficult for the Air Force because we're technical experts, so you need a technical expertise to start with, which usually means that you grow up in some career field through about major, and then you jump to be a foreign area officer. You apply and then get into the program. Since the FAO program has started in the Air Force, we've kind of played around with potentially starting in the FAO career field and then just growing up your entire career. But it's difficult, just the way the human resources work in the Air Force and the personnel system. You have to be, in order to become a lieutenant colonel or a colonel, you got to do a command, and you got to be in charge of people, and you got to do certain things to get to that level. So you kind of have to bounce back and forth. So you have one of the key things to do is to learn a language, right? So if you're looking to be a foreign area officer, highly encourage you to learn a language in the area that you want to be in. Learning a lot about the history and the culture of the place that you're going. And then, being immersed in that, whether it's with an assignment in that area, as in your area of expertise to start with, and then to become a foreign area officer there, or to just, know, or maybe have parents, or something like that. But all that said, I didn't have any of that. I had never been assigned to Korea. I didn't know the language. I was actually about ready to retire. And I got a call out of the blue saying, "Hey, would you like to still be, when you become a colonel, you can volunteer worldwide for deployments as a foreign area officer, as an attaché." And I had done that and didn't get picked up. And then I did mid-cycle. And then they said, "Hey, sure, I'll go. Why not?" It was just in the middle of the Fire and Fury days. If you remember, 2018, 2017. And I called my wife at home, and she's a former missileer. And I said, "Hey, do you still want to go to Korea?" And she said, "Yeah, man, if there's a nuclear war, I want to be at ground zero. I don't want to be on the, I want to be front and center." So she was all in, and that's really what it takes. Your family has to be all in on it, because they're a big part of it as well. I've got two kids. I had a daughter going into high school and a son that was going into junior high. And now we stayed there 4 years in order to get her graduated through high school. And now my son is going in high school. And, they're as much a part of the experiences as I was. My wife was arm in arm as we were going to events and meeting high-level officials. So it's a family event. And, you're there for, the reason you're there is to represent your country. So you want to make sure that everybody is all in.
Yeah, that's and did they send you to language school? Did you get a chance to?
I did. So mine was shortened. It really should be a year and a half. They can only really allow about a year, and I only got about 4 months. So
Uh-oh.
I learned to say my name, introduce myself, and maybe order some kimbap.
Yeah. Yeah, that's and your spouse and kids, did they get the language training as well, or?
Yeah, my Utula did as well. So she went to 4 months. It was 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. So, you know, maybe if I'd been smarter, I would have learned more. But Korean's a pretty tough language. Um,
Yeah.
so she
And
learned enough to get.
so
But most
yeah.
people speak English anyway, luckily. So it wasn't a huge hindrance. Could I have done my job better if I'd been fluent? Absolutely, there's no doubt. Could I have done my job better if I'd had previous uh, connections and relationships with Koreans? Absolutely, because that's what it's all about. It's about making and maintaining relationships with allies.
And so the school, they send you to a school, like, for understanding how to, cultural relations and how to eat properly and all those kinds of things. How long is the school that they send folks to?
Yeah, JMS is 6 months.
Six
So
months, yeah.
and it's a point school, so all of the services send folks there.
So when you got there, how did you sort of take on the role, and what was day-to-day life like when you're the attaché?
Yeah, so I dove right in. It was pre-COVID, and we went to events probably 4 or 5 times a week, which means that you're going to work to kind of interact with the people in the embassy. You work very closely with the political section, the economic section, public affairs. That's protocol, all of those sections within the embassy, and then directly with front office with the ambassador and the deputy chief of mission. And so that's kind of your day-to-day interactions. doing office work. And then at night, after you get dressed up and you're going out to events. So, and you're not getting paid overtime, right? So you're working sometimes 16 hours a day or more. And, I say work, you're going to a party, but, you're going to a party with a purpose. So you're trying to, whether it's to find out more about what's going on in the world or to try to talk to a specific person and try to make a relationship there. That's kind of what it's all about.
Yeah, interesting. And did in the end, for your family, is it still, as the United States has sort of pulled back a lot of its overseas facilities and bases, is it still that same sort of, are you sort of out on the town, or do you still have that support structure that used to be there?
Yeah. So for the most part, attachés are alone and unafraid. They have, very little support structure in the countries that they're in. In Korea, it's a little bit different because you've got a 4-star command, right, and multiple 3-star commands. So the DAT is not the senior defense official, the SDO in Korea. And there's a lot of support structure that exists within USFK, CNFK, the Marine contingent there, and the 7th Air Force and all of that. So all that said, we're stationed up in Seoul, where Yongsan is and was. But there used to be 30,000 GIs up there in Yongsan, and at the time that we arrived in 2019, they had just moved down to Pyeongtaek and Camp Humphreys. So there was this huge exodus of people and support structure from Yongsan down to Pyeongtaek, and the base was slowly closing. So over the course of 4 years, what was a huge thriving base in the middle of Seoul and that metropolis, by the time I left, had been reduced down to basically 2 streets, the Dragon Hill Lodge and Embassy Housing, which still exists there. So, yeah. So, and even that, is more than many attachés get when they just have to live off the economy, because at least we had a commissary and a community of old army cinder block duplexes in which to live, but it was kind of like a little bit of America, and so yeah, it was like it was kind of like being in a prison, especially during COVID when we couldn't actually go off the base. So for 2 years almost, the Koreans had pretty extensive COVID restrictions. They always said that they didn't shut down, but you couldn't go to a bar or a restaurant or a movie theater or a gym or a spa or anywhere. Everything was closed for over a year. And then, it slowly started opening back up. They just got rid of mask mandates in hospitals this March. So, I mean, when your job is to go out and have dinner with people and you can't go out to dinner, it makes it difficult to do your job.
So as we shift the conversation and talk about your observations, if you were to describe for our listeners, many of whom may have some limited experience or understanding of Korea, the Korean people, how would you describe the Korean people and their view of the United States?
Yeah, so the Korean people as a whole are at the top of supporters in the U.S. If you look at the polls, I think the only country that supports the U.S. more is Kosovo. And so the Kosovars and the Koreans are at, near 85% support for the U.S. right now. But that's variable, and it depends on, what administration is in power, both in the U.S. and Korea, and what events are going on, whether it's with DPRK or Japan or China or any or Russia even. So, but generally speaking, the Koreans are very supportive of Americans and the American presence there. Just like in the American presence in Japan, there when you're right around a base, the the people tend to not support as much because they see the immediate impact. But strategically speaking, the Koreans have been happy that we've been there since 1950.
Yeah. Now it's that time in the show where we have to take a quick break, but when we get back, I want you to tell me about your sort of observations in regards to what you think the North Koreans are doing and how do the South Koreans understand that. So
Okay.
you're listening to Nuclecast. We're talking to Colonel Glen Schilland, the former Air Attaché in South Korea, and we'll be right back. This episode of Nuclecast is brought to you by the AMLA Deterrence Center, whose mission is to educate Americans about the nuclear enterprise and strategic deterrence. And we're back, and we're talking to Colonel Glen Schilland. So, Glen, before the break, I asked you, what's your take on the North Koreans and their nuclear program, and then how do the South Koreans view that program?
Yeah, so that's a long history, right? There's a lot to pack in. I'm not sure I could cover it in 15 minutes even. But like I was saying about the relationship with the United States, the relationship with North Korea also depends on the administration. And obviously, I'm talking about the South Korean administration because the administration in North Korea doesn't change, right? It's the Kim family. It's always been the Kim family since the Korean War, or since World War II, actually. And nothing, honestly, is really going to change unless the administration changes up in the North. So regardless of the outreach or the differences in approaches that the South Koreans take or the Americans take or the the six-party talks or whatever, we have tried a lot of things over the last 50 years. And as a lowly colonel, I'm not going to second guess what generations of people that are much smarter than me have done to try to reconcile with the North. But what the North has done during that time is built up their nuclear strength. Right? They've somehow gotten a nuclear program, whether it was through the help of the Russians or the Chinese, or by their own know-how. Because despite what people think, the North Koreans are not stupid, and they do have a strong education system that's focused on certain things like the nuclear program or cyber attacks or supporting themselves. They're very focused on the Juche ideology of being self-supporting. So regardless of how much and we've seen 70 years worth of economic sanctions hasn't really done anything to stop that. It may have slowed it down a little bit, but they were able to develop a nuclear program, right, and develop rocketry to deliver those weapon systems. So the relationship with the South and what the South has tried to do is and this is a big part of our relationship with the U.S., is made sure that they have a strong enough force to deter the North Koreans from ever using those weapons. And that's really, as we know, what nuclear weapons are for, is for deterrence. So, the South Koreans realize that, and they realize that they need the United States to provide that nuclear umbrella, the extended deterrence. And we've, expressed that very clearly for decades. And, to be fair, the South Koreans have wanted and have pursued a nuclear program for themselves in the past. And we've dissuaded them from that back in the 70s. And I feel that we've done a fairly decent job of doing that again here in recent days. With some of the changes that we've made with the Nuclear Consultative Group, with the Washington Declaration, and with some of the actions that we've taken since the UNID administration has come into power, to show that we're still committed to that extended deterrence. And I'm talking about sending, there was recently a nuclear submarine that was sent there the first in a long, long time, maybe the first ever, that's been, announced in advance. We've also started flying B-52s over the peninsula, which is the first time in 5 years. First time since I was the 608th AOC commander back in 2016 to 2018. That was the last time we'd flown B-52s. Nothing when I was there to my day. And then as soon as I leave, the day I left, they flew a B-52 over the peninsula. So, all that's to say is some administrations in the South try to pursue reunification more heavily through negotiations. Some of them tried to do it through peace through strength, like the Yoon administration is doing right now, and through deterrence. So there's many different approaches, but really not a lot is going to change until North Korea decides that they're going to give up nuclear weapons and try to somehow reunify.
Yeah, whenever the last time I was there a few years back, I remember, I sort of had a sense that the Chinese were sort of the key partner for the North Koreans. But one of the things that the South Koreans, a point that they made was like, hey, it's not really that China is a puppet master pulling the North Korean strings. In some respects, there's that old adage that the borrower is slave to the lender. But in the case of the North Koreans and the Chinese, it's sort of the reverse, where the North Koreans are now the puppet masters of the Chinese because the North Koreans have become so, bellicose and so, they've built an arsenal that could really cause problems throughout the regime. And so now, and this was a point that the South Koreans were making, was that we sort of think that it's not China pulling strings, it's North Korea doing things to shape the Chinese behavior. When if China were to sort of shut down the border and shut down aid and assistance, it would be hard for North Korea to feed itself, to survive. How do you see that relationship between China and North Korea?
Yeah, well, you talk about shutting down the border. That's exactly what they did during COVID. So for 3 years, the border was completely shut down between China and North Korea, and they survived, right? So they're capable of doing that. They've shown through the 90s that they're capable of surviving off grass and bark, right? It seems incredible and possible, but they're able to do that. So I wouldn't even say that they're dependent on the Chinese for support. And certainly not pulling puppet strings of Xi Jinping. I mean, if he ever heard you say that, I don't know what to say about that. No, but KGU, Kim Jong Un, and his father before him and his grandfather are extremely good at using what little leverage they have to get what they need to survive, and to balance on a fine line of getting support, whether it's from China or from the U.S. or from South Korea, because we've also given them support when they needed it. We're not against giving them humanitarian aid. Even during COVID, we were offering vaccines and food and also in medicines and all these sorts of things. Whether or not the North Koreans accept it, which they didn't, is up to them. But sometimes they do and sometimes they don't. It's whatever they feel that they can get away with. But I honestly think that the Chinese are more afraid that that the North Koreans might use nuclear weapons against them. Like those short range missiles are not just pointed at Seoul; they're also pointed towards Beijing, right? And not in a threatening manner, but just in a hey, you can't push me around manner, right? So I mean, the purpose of nuclear weapons is political, right? So if you've got that big stick, you have a little bit more say in what people can and can't do against you. So I think that's more in the realm of what the relationship between South Korea or North Korea and China is. It's not adversarial. It's not necessarily supporting. They're just kind of not even allies, although they do have a mutual defense treaty within the two. So, but it's a very tenuous relationship, I would say.
Would you say that for the Chinese, the primary desire is to prevent the collapse of North Korea because that could potentially mean the unification of Korea under a sort of Western liberal democracy that could potentially see the Americans on their border, and that's what they fear? Or is there another, reason that they're sort of bound together?
I think the PRC specifically, they don't want North Korea to go away because it takes our focus off of them. So it's this big thorn in our side that's always been there that we have to put resources towards, and that could be used potentially as a second front, which has been used as a second front, right? I mean,
Sure.
let's be honest. PRC was the main uh, belligerent in the Korean War, right? They're the only reason why the peninsula is still divided right now. If it hadn't been for their intervention, it would have been reunified, right? So they're they are they would not want to see a reunification under South Korean government for sure. They wouldn't want to see a larger presence by the West. They don't even want us to be allies with the South Koreans. They're trying at every opportunity to put a wedge between us and South Korea, between South Korea and Japan. They constantly, they fly between South Korea and Japan with the Russians on an annual basis to fly around Dokdo or the Fukushima, not Takashima, also Leoncourt rocks, right? Using all the names for that little piece of land in between that both Japan and Korea claim. China knows about that, and they constantly poke at it to mess with them and to see what the Chinese or what the Japanese and the Koreans will do and what we'll do about it, which up until now is very little. So the Chinese are good at trying to drive wedges between people and trying to drive us away from our allies, and they'll continue to do that as much as they can.
So if I were to, and I've, it's become my custom at the end of every show to pull out my genie, Bob, who grants 3 wishes. And if I pull out my lamp and rub that lamp and Bob gives you 3 wishes, what would your 3 wishes be for the Korean Peninsula? And let's say that they're wishes that you think are they wouldn't even have to be magic. They would have to be plausible. What would 3 plausible wishes be?
Yeah. So how about the Kim family abdicates to a government that is amenable to a federated reunification, such that they don't give up North Korean sovereignty, and you have a North Korea and a South Korea, but it's a kind of a not belligerent, right? I think that would be the best case if somehow we were able to get the Kim family and put them up in a chalet in Switzerland somewhere, and then give the government to somebody that is willing to at least work with the South Koreans on improving their economy. And to be fair, every administration in the South has offered that, whether it's Moon or Yoon on either side of the political spectrum. And we've also encouraged that. Even now, we say that we're willing to negotiate without any preconditions and talk. But honestly, the North Koreans haven't picked up the phone in the last 2 or 3 years to even talk about anything since about 2019, in fact. So yeah, I mean, that's obviously the number one wish, is that the Kim family would just kind of gracefully go away. Do I really get 3 wishes?
You get 3, but
Yeah,
only 3.
Yeah, and only for the Korean Peninsula, right?
Yeah.
So
Yep.
one would obviously be that the Koreans and the Japanese would get along. We really, really need them to cooperate on a very basic level and on every level. And again, this is an outsider's point of view. They obviously have historical differences that are almost impossible to reconcile, and I'm very aware of those cultural differences. But you gave me a wish, right? So if the Koreans and the Japanese could just let bygones be bygones and look towards the future of a cooperative society, then that would be fantastic, and I think that would be better for everyone. Maybe not the PRC, but for everyone who has a positive outlook on that area. And then third wish, I think it would be that the Koreans would maintain their relationship with the United States, build their relationships with Europe and Africa and Southeast Asia, as they're trying to do. I have encouraged them to do that the 4 years that I was there, and I wish them well in their goal to be what Yoon calls a global pivotal state. They certainly have the economic punch to do that, although I think they're punching above their weight sometimes. But they also need to come into their own and really feel that they deserve that. They have a little bit of an inferiority complex. A little, they call themselves the shrimp between two whales, between China and Japan. But if they can just kind of get over that and just, meet the world as themselves, I think they'll do great for the world. And they really are doing that culturally, with the K dramas and the K-pop and all of the K social stuff. They are doing that outreach throughout the world, and they are also exporting. They're I think the sixth largest military exporter in the world as well, and hope to be the fourth in a few years. So they're really coming into their own after 70 years of amazing buildup.
Glen, Shilland, thanks for joining us on NucleCast to talk about South Korea. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Thanks for having me, Adam. I enjoyed it.
And thanks to you, the listeners, for joining us on this episode. Hopefully you found this discussion of South Korea one that was interesting and informative. And we also hope that you'll join us on the next episode of NucleCast. Well, great talk with Glen Shilland. Glen is, he's a friend, known him a while, and it's, the air attaché in a country like South Korea, it's a place where there's a lot going on, a lot of moving parts, and just to be able to sort of understand where the South Koreans are coming from, how they see issues, because we Americans sort of mirror image, almost everybody. And so to really get to be able to understand what other people are thinking, why they think it, what motivates them, and to pierce those cultural divides or those sort of surface level relationships, which is what an air attaché gets to do. That's sort of really invaluable. And so it was great to be able to talk to Glen about his 4 years as the air attaché. Hopefully you enjoyed the conversation as well.
This has been a production of the ANWA Deterrence Center. Our executive producer is Kimberly Charrington, and this episode has been engineered and mixed by David Krumthal. Follow the show on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter at NucleCast. Listen, follow, and review the show on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts.